Okay, so let's get going with our event. Hi everyone, welcome again to our 2021 Anthropology MA Expo. The MA Expo was developed for a couple of reasons. The first is to create a very exciting opportunity for our graduate students to share some of their incredible research with their peers and also with anthropology faculty. The second goal is to provide comments and feedbacks to the presenters on their projects. So the Expo is formatted very similarly to a professional conference. Each presenter will have 15 minutes to share their research, followed by a 10-minute Q&A session whereby attendees can ask questions and share feedback. For the presenters, do note that I will be timing you in your presentations, and I will give you a 2 and a 1 minute warning in the chat box when your time is almost up. So our presenters for tonight, and they are in alphabetical order, include Erica Hill, Ben Holt, and Jessie Valdez. So without further ado, let us all welcome our first graduate presenter, Erica Hill.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here first, of course. Can you see my slides? Awesome. My name is Erica Hill. I am presenting to you today my thesis research, Chinese childhood play, Deconstructing Hegemonic Narratives in Northern California Chinatowns. I will tell you a little bit of a different story than one that you often will hear when it comes to Chinese American history, one which uncovers information about Chinese families, women, and children. My project directly challenges hegemonic narratives when it comes to lasting stereotypes about Chinese immigrant communities, that they were only insular male bachelor populations. I'll provide some background on this topic, including how this project began, before delving into the methods and impact of using childhood play artifacts to challenge these lasting stereotypes. This project began in the Special Collections Room at Chico State in early 2017 when I came across this map, a bird's eye view of Chico in 1871. As you can see in this corner over here that's circled in red, Chico had a segregated Chinatown. I was horrified to discover that I had never heard of the Chico Chinatown. As I was researching, I discovered that Chico had 3 historic Chinatowns. All were destroyed by arson between 1860 and 1920. I found out a lot about these 3 Chinatowns and the extreme violence which occurred in the area by examining archival sources and historical literature, but I struggled to develop insight into how people lived decades in a racialized, segregated community. I found that early Chinese American history was lacking individual perspective, focused on violence and racialized arguments, including topics of culture clash, and was written by the perspective of the subjugators. Chinese voices were missing from historic narratives of Northern California Chinatowns. When I began at San Francisco State, I knew that I wanted to question narratives surrounding historic Chinatowns in California. The history books seem to repeat the same narratives, which I'm showing you here. The first Chinese immigrants arrived in California in the 1850s. The demographic of this population was mostly poor male laborers trying to earn enough money in California from the gold rush and then other labor opportunities to send back to China. For various reasons, such as the belief that Chinese people were contributing nothing to the economy, were foreign, unchristian, heathen, jeopardizing American values, and many more racist arguments. Between 1850 and 1880, anti-Chinese sentiments grew into a political movement. The growing movement out of California became organized. Anti-Chinese leagues formed. Groups of vigilantes murdered Chinese people, set fire to Chinatowns, and ran Chinese communities from whole towns. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act became the first federal law to bar a cultural group from naturalization, citizenship, and rights based on ethnicity. The Chinese Exclusion Act was renewed every 10 years until after World War II. Exclusion of Chinese immigrants did not get repealed until perceptions of Chinese people changed. This was largely caused by China becoming allies with the US during World War II. After World War II, perceptions of Chinese immigrants changed from them being seen as an alien class to a model minority. Hegemony is defined as the dominance of one group over another, often supported by legitimating norms and ideas. My project directly questions two hegemonic narratives in early Chinese American history: that Chinese immigrant communities were poor bachelor societies, and that Chinese immigrant communities were unwilling to Americanize. Because the Chinese immigrant population was mostly male, white citizens developed anti-Chinese stereotypes, including arguments that Chinese people did not want to settle in the US, nor did they want to Americanize. White communities perceived illicit behaviors of opium smoking, gambling, prostitution, and Tong warfare to be contributed only by Chinese immigrant communities. Perceived foreign behaviors of dress, diet, and consumer behaviors were proliferated by news media and justified anti-Chinese legislation. These stereotypes have biased contemporary perceptions of Chinese cultural traditions and the Chinese family. Archaeologists have proven that historical narratives of early Chinese immigration can be broadened. Williams, 2008, comments on Western hegemonic masculinity and the perceptions of Chinese as inferior because they were less manly than white men. For example, Williams argues that white men effeminize Chinese men for their traditional braid. This project examines decades of Chinese American history from 1850 to 1940 to call into question the male-only stereotype and the idea that Chinese people did not want to stay in the United States or become a part of their communities. This questioning of this is achieved by examining Chinese families, childhood, and childhood play artifacts. My project deconstructs hegemonic narratives in Northern California Chinatowns by examining the existing Wairika Chinatown collection under the theme of Chinese childhood play. The Wairika Chinatown collection is an extant archaeological collection of over 10,000 artifacts excavated in 1969. An archaeological report of this excavation was just completed by Sarah Hefner in 2019. My project specifically examines an assemblage of 344 play-associated artifacts from the collection. I analyzed these artifacts, historical archival data, such as maps, photographs, and newspaper articles, and literature written by Chinese people about their experiences. Anne Mendelsohn, in her 2016 book, states, "The crux of the matter is that the Chinese were far less likely than any other newcomers to form immigrant families. Only after many decades of struggle on this continent did the broad Chinese community in the United States achieve anything roughly comparable to an immigrant footing." What Mendelsohn describes corresponds with the historical and archaeological data on Chinese immigrant families. During the global Chinese diaspora of the 19th century, it was mostly poor males who emigrated to the United States between 1850 and 1880. Scholars reasoned that the high proportion of males was due in part to economics and violence, but hostility can't answer it all. There is also traditional Chinese families and limitations from US immigration policy. Chinese customs include that married families moved with their husbands, and when married young men emigrated to the United States, they often did not bring their wives. However, Chinese women did emigrate to the United States in the 19th century. If they were married, women were hidden from the public. If single, women were perceived as prostitutes. In the 1875 Page Act, outlawed the immigration of Chinese prostitution, but had the effect of stopping nearly all immigration of single or poor Chinese women. Fujino 2000 states, US policies sought to limit the immigration of Asian women and what they represented: children, families, and permanent residency. Chinese women and children represent an important minority group in Chinese immigrant communities. In 1860, the gender ratio of Chinese males to females was 19:1. In 1870, 13:1, and in 1880, 21:1. From 1850 to 1924, women made up 5% of the Chinese population in the US. Despite these gender inequalities, between 1910 and 1930, the percentage of native-born Chinese Americans grew from 20% to 51%. My point here is that while it's true that Chinese men outnumbered women and children in the 19th century, women, children, and Chinese families existed, even though they are missing from the narrative. By the start of the 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act had been in place. Sorry guys, I got my second COVID shot, so I'm a little dizzy. By the start of the 1900s, the Chinese Exclusion Act had been in place for 2 decades. Chinese immigrants could not emigrate unless they were from the wealthy and political classes. Yet first and second Chinese immigrant American children were born and growing up in Northern California. My research argues Chinese children were active participants in their communities and should not be ignored as actors in the past. The focus of Chinese children directly challenges the racialized and patriarchal stigma that Chinese immigrant communities were male-only bachelor societies. I draw here from research done in the late 20th century and 21st century. Archaeologists in the US argue that Chinese immigrant communities did not assimilate or acculturate, since archaeologists found predominantly Chinese material culture in early Chinese immigrant sites. Paul Mullen's 2011 seminal article, The Archaeology of Consumption, states, archaeologists have focused on the material distinctions of Chinese immigrant assemblages, which often include many Chinese material goods. So the material record appears to paint Chinese immigrants as excluding themselves from consumer culture. By assuming that Chinese immigrants did not participate in American consumer culture, scholars in the 20th century reaffirmed racialized narratives that Chinese people did not want to be active participants in their communities and would rather purchase Chinese goods, send money back home to China, and eventually return to their ancestral home outside of the US. These narratives are rooted in the 19th century anti-Chinese xenophobia and do not accurately represent the reality of the first Chinese Americans, who were active participants in their communities. Recent scholarship in Chinese diaspora archaeology is challenging assumptions about material culture found at Chinese immigrant sites and the consumer choices of Chinese people in the United States. Camp 2011 argues that an understanding of consumer citizenship can help inform researchers about immigrant population, social goals, and standing, including constraints of marginalization that limited an immigrant's ability within a racist community. Camp 2011 defines the values of 19th century consumer citizenship as being rooted in patriotic ideals displayed by purchasing American-made goods. Scholars such as Curano 2007 argue that the values of the 19th century consumer citizenship shifted from being centered on a man's ability to perform hard labor to a man's ability to purchase American-made goods. This was likely a direct result of the influx of Chinese laborers in the mid-century. Camp 2011 maintains food, medicine, and toys are the 3 main artifact groups which can best illustrate individuals' purchasing power, social standing, and negotiation of social marginalization in consumer choice, or lack thereof, in racialized communities. The presence of American-made children's consumer items at historic archaeological Chinese immigrant community sites directly contests the stereotype that Chinatowns were insular communities whose residents didn't participate in their local economies. Of the 344 artifacts in the Wairika Chinatown collection play assemblage, 50 artifacts were children's play objects. Hubley Manufacturing Company produced many of the tractors and other agricultural toys, toy guns, and steel embossed cars in the collection. Hubley Manufacturing Company began producing toys in 1884, after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and still produce toys today. While many of these toys cannot be identified to specific consumer items, despite hours of going through catalogs, the presence of Hubley toys does indicate that the residents of Wairika were purchasing American consumer items and investing in the welfare of the children. In their study of childhood in San Francisco's Chinatown, Jure 2009 argues that there is a present need for researchers to recognize the unique experience and importance of women and children, to recognize the larger patterns of family, kinship, and intergenerational continuity, and the change for first and second generation Chinese Americans. To do this, Jure argues that researchers need to separate the male-only stigma from the narrative of early Chinese immigrant communities, which, through historical processes of racialization are portrayed in the US as illicit and impoverished male bachelor societies. While historical archaeologists are uniquely capable to uncover rich narratives from our past, child development and intergenerational social behaviors at 19th century Chinatown sites are underrepresented. Archaeologists cannot ignore the many matrices of social identity construction, nor oversimplify the range of human diversity in the past. On the issue of childhood representation in archaeology, Camp 2015 calls to action that the inclusion of children in the story of the past is just as vital as the incorporation of women, that age can no more be ignored than gender. The issues surrounding gender and ethnicity for emerging immigrant communities in the United States remain significant. Louis 2000 defines structural issues as those which are forced by a powerful group on the last powerful one. In the 19th century, US immigration laws targeted the chances of immigrants in forming traditional families. The imbalance in population of Chinese men to women caused by these structural forces in the 19th century lasted throughout the 20th century. It wasn't until about 2000 that the population distribution of Chinese males to females in the US equaled out. Lasting stereotypes from the anti-Chinese movement and exclusion era continue to impact life for Asian Americans today. Since the mid-20th century, perceptions of Chinese Americans have shifted. Instead of being an alien immigrant group, Chinese Americans have been seen as the model minority. The stereotype proliferated by 19th century media that Chinese Americans in Chinatowns were unclean resurfaces during every global pandemic. I personally witnessed the effects of increased racial antagonism towards Chinese Americans in my lifetime during the bird flu epidemic of the early 2000s and current COVID-19 pandemic while living in proximity to San Francisco's Chinatown. Little 2020 positions that the use of the term China virus to describe COVID-19 has increased Chinese racism and fuels racial violence. Little's 2020 prediction has come true in some form as racial violence against Asian people has visibly increased with incidents in San Francisco and with the tragic Atlanta spa shootings. Racial violence against Asian Americans in the 21st century is not just physical. The fetishism of Chinese women and emasculation of Chinese men has persisted into the 21st century. In the 19th century, Chinese women seen in public were perceived to be prostitutes, while Chinese men were seen as effeminate because of their dress, hair, and occupation. Chow 2012 identifies the clash between Eastern and Western ideals of gender and sexuality as one of the factors which perpetuates these stereotypes. Furthermore, Chow argues that hegemonic masculinity, the dominant ideals personified by men about how men should be, is used to dominate Chinese men and women, positioning that Chinese men and women are less than the average human. It is my hope as a historical archaeologist not only to call into question historical hegemonic narratives, but also call into question the basis for racial antagonism and racial violence today. I want to thank you all for participating and listening to my presentation and dealing with me on my day 2 of my COVID shot. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Erica, for sharing your project and your research with us. So we do have 10 minutes for a Q&A, so I'm going to open the floor for you all now to ask Erica any questions about her project, about her research. Feel free to use video, or if you would like, you can also type your questions into the chat. Don't be shy.
Go for it.
All right, well, Erica, I have a question for you.
Oh, Abraham has his hand
Abraham
up.
had his
Oh,
hand up.
sorry, I didn't see the hand. Go ahead.
Erica, can you hear me?
It's a little crackly. Sorry about that.
That's fine. Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you now.
Part of the degree requirements, one of the courses is literature review. Were you able to use your that course within literature review to be part of your thesis?
To clarify, you're asking, sorry, it is a little crackly on my end. Was I able to use my literature review class for my thesis? Okay, yeah, so I definitely was able to utilize every class available at San Francisco State. As an incoming graduate student, I'm sure you're excited. I would say that all of the classes, you should try to gear your research towards it. My literature review was my first semester, so let me draw back to that. And I was able to focus on the anti-Chinese movement and violence as a background. And from that pretty much became chapter 2 of my thesis.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Hi, Doug.
Yeah, can I ask maybe a general question? So you're at near the end of your journey through the program. What was sort of the big 1 or 2 challenges, the biggest challenges you had to overcome in the last couple of years in getting this finished? What if you were going to advise incoming students, what should they look out for?
My biggest advice is chase the data. Have something you're working on that is concrete data in front of you. And also, I'm a flowery writer. I'm a very personable writer, right? So I can get lost in words when it comes to the thesis proposal. You want to be at the place where you've done your literature reviews. And I was reading the entire time I was in the program, even before, right? This is a project I started before I started the program. So always having something in front of you that you're reading and taking notes on, and chasing the data that you can describe for yourself.
I have a question from Nikki, and then Cindy, and then Sunanda. I see Nikki typed hers in. She beat you all to it. So I'll start with Nikki's question. Nikki has a question in the chat that says, how badly has COVID affected biases?
I would argue that this project has been extremely hard. I say I'm studying racialized immigration, and some of the trends that I've seen in my own lifetime are reoccurring from what I study. Because of the pandemic, I immediately started recording what I was seeing on Twitter and the internet when it came to terms like the China virus, and trying within my personal communities to advocate for Chinese Americans and Asian Americans who are already facing a lot of different cultural problems because of not just the Chinese exclusion movement, not just Japanese internment, not all these things that have happened in the past 100 years. There's a lot of research out right now about how much it's affecting Asian Americans today with racism. And so you have this duality between being the model minority and now being the vector for COVID. And I would say that it's horrifying to watch from my position and what I write on.
Okay, we have a question from Sunanda and then Cindy.
Hi, Erica. So my question is, first, thanks for acknowledging the Stop API hate movement. So something I have witnessed is that I've noticed that anthropologists who are studying Asian diasporas, not necessarily Chinese diasporas, but just Asian diasporas, very few have actually spoken out about the hate crimes that are going on towards the API community. And in some of Dr. Reichneider's classes, we've talked about archaeologists or archaeology as a discipline tending to be apolitical or staying away from politics. So I was curious if you intend this project or all future projects to be kind of viewed in a political or an advocatory nature.
I once said in my undergrad, I want to be the lawyer Nader of my generation. So I do hope to do a little bit of that. I think we're kind of taught in our classes to stay apolitical, to be neutral, to be culturally relative. And it's a little different when you're living in, you know, something that's happening now versus 100 years ago. So in archaeology, you can be removed from how the past affects us today. And I think as a generation of anthropologists, we're growing more into an advocate anthropology space, especially being San Francisco State students. I've never felt so open to talk about these topics. And I think that in my future work, I'll try to stay devil's advocate, which is where I like to be at. But personally, it's hard not to let those political things stem through when you're not dealing with something that's in the past. This is something that's currently happening.
Okay, and Cindy, you had a question as well?
Yeah, those were some great questions. First, I'd like to say that was a beautiful presentation.
I got taught well.
So the question that I was going to ask was this your intention to study this particular sort of project when you came to the program? Or was it something that developed after you arrived? So how did you kind of come on to this particular topic?
Well, Meredith deserves a lot of kudos here. We started in my first semester knowing that I wanted to work in some sort of Asian diaspora, probably Chinese diaspora because of my previous research. Also, she got me going really quickly on sending emails out to find that data and had me reading, reading everything I could, sending me articles. And what I found from the Wairika Chinatown collection, which I did choose because I have a friend at the statewide collections archaeological facility. So I was working with her on what different things were out there. I originally wanted to do an extant collection that hadn't really been studied before, because my ethics are like, why are we still digging when we have so many things out there in collections that aren't studied? So it was only until January of last year that an archaeological report was even published. And so I had the benefit of a great advisor, the benefit of networking skills that had a friend at the collections facility. And for me, it was either going to be medicine or childhood, because I wanted to comment on women and children. It's just totally missing from Chinese American history. And it's not missing from archaeological reports, but it is missing in the general narrative that people are told. And so when I started looking into the children's toys, I actually also included gambling objects as a little poke at the typologies of archaeology and the setting apart of Western and Eastern material culture. And so it all fell together into a passion project that was really hard to avoid. Honestly, it was just really hard to avoid.
Any more questions? I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through my participants. Okay. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I'm gonna spend Erica, you have 1 minute and 23 seconds before we need to move on to the next speaker. But you have this really, I think, compelling argument in this. I have a research question for you. In your thesis about the importance of focusing specifically on childhood. So I was wondering if you could spend the next minute just talking a little bit about why you chose childhood as your analytic category and you didn't choose something else like gender, for example. Like why are you studying that particular group of individuals or that particular social identity?
Thank you for asking me that. I think that childhood's a really interesting topic because as it's becoming more part of archaeology and there's this development of a childhood archaeology subfield, there's more recognition across archaeologists that children must have been important actors in the past and represented a very high population, especially when you consider life expectancy traditionally went down as you aged. Also, you can learn so much about how a society cares for each other through how they care about their children. And you can also see so much about the parents through childhood. And it becomes an avenue not only to study the children and the parents, but also the greater society. And what I found really fascinating was how much we care so much about children and always are voting for children's hospitals, yet they're completely missing from our talk of the past until the past 20 years. And so for me, it was this kind of confluence of All right, Chinese diaspora archaeology is becoming more interdisciplinary, more intersectional, and so is childhood archaeology. And there's only a few cases where they're mixed together. Yet you've got this broad history of Chinese diaspora archaeology. And for me, I just felt like if we're going to talk about racialized immigration, we needed to hit people where it hurt. And that's when you talk about children.
All right, thank you, Erica. Really, really excellent research, really great presentation. Thank you so much for sharing with us. For the sake of time, we are going to move on to our second presenter. And our second presenter is Ben Holt, who will be sharing his thesis research with us right now. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
Hey everyone. Can everyone hear me? See the slides? Okay. Thumbs up. Good. Okay. Thank you all for coming to the, I think is the first virtual MA Expo. Again, my name is Benjamin Holt. I've been here longer than some of the faculty at SFSU, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm a medical anthropologist here. And I have a question for you today. Can what we don't know hurt us? Can what we don't know protect us or even heal us from those same things? And even though this age-old idiom may seem obviously incorrect, because we are constantly discovering new threats to our health every day in the world that were in the unknown only yesteryear. The same way that we're uncovering new ways to insulate ourselves from these health risks every day. So maybe a better question is, how much unknown are you willing to accept before something becomes too risky to engage in? And when I started this thesis in 2017, I asked myself these same questions about vaporizing cannabis, which I had seen blow through my community in Sonoma County in California. And I wanted to question and engage the people in my community about this same question, how they perceived cannabis vaporizer information and behavior and their own behaviors with it. But before I can jump into the nitty gritty about vaporizing cannabis, I recognize that some of my topic is a little bit, has a bit of technical jargon, and I don't want to lose you all. So we're going to go back and do a little bit of background first, get you really comfortable looking at pictures of cannabis and talking about cannabis. So first and foremost, this slide particularly is, my bad there. This slide's particularly for Mark, because I tried to do all the taxonomy stuff correctly. Cannabis is actually the genus name for the plant that we're talking about. It's in the kingdom, the plant kingdom. It's part of the family of Cannabaceae, which also includes hops that we make beer out of. Species or subspecies, people recognize sativa indica and maybe ruderalis if you're really savvy, but actually sativa is the only species of cannabis that's recognized. The rest are more like just like cultural names that we've come across. Now, cannabis contains cannabinoids. Now, these are chemical compounds like THC and CBD that actually give you the psychoactive feeling from cannabis, and they grow on the plant itself. The picture on the left is a picture of what are called trichomes. These are where these chemical compounds actually grow on the plant itself. Now, another word you may have heard of, hemp, not actually a strain or a subspecies of cannabis. It is a legal term for cannabis that is cultivated for non-drug use, for textiles and things like that. Now, to get us all up to speed and to make sure that we're know the names of the things that we're talking about here, we're going to do a little quiz. Now, don't worry, I don't want to stress any of you out. I'm sure you all have lots of quizzes and things to grade and deal with already. So it's going to be really low key. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So on the left, we have product types, the cannabis flower or shake, as well as on the bottom, delivery methods of edibles or the traditional joint, as people call it, smoking cannabis. So these two methods are really ancient methods for cannabis consumption that it's happened, I think some of the theories around 6,000 years into history of different cultures around the world using it. Moving forward, things like bongs are also pretty old, different elaborate pipes for smoking cannabis. Now these two in the middle, these are cannabis extracts. We're getting closer to what I'm talking about. The first on the left is hash, that people have probably heard of. The first on the right is resin. Now these are cannabis extracts, which means that you extract the cannabinoids I was talking about earlier from the flower itself using temperature and pressure in order to get these things off. These are usually contain higher concentrations of these compounds that I'm talking about. What you can do with these is put them in vaporizers. Now below, this is what I'm talking about. The one on the left has name brand recognition. It's called a Volcano. It's for vaporizing cannabis flower, like up on the left here. The one on the right, maybe you've heard of, Dab, is a dab rig. Dab rigs can vaporize pretty much anything at extremely high temperatures. Moving forward, the product on the top right, this is also what I'm really focusing on here. These are a different form of cannabis extracts. So these are called solvent-based cannabis extracts or chemical-based cannabis extracts, because rather than just temperature and heat, or sorry, temperature and pressure, they are utilizing a chemical solvent as well to be able to extract these at higher temperatures, or sorry, higher pressures and low temperatures. Lots of math here. These are used in vape pens. I hope you guys can see that on the bottom. Another form of delivery method that I'm talking about today. So if you look on the left side of this graph, a lot of that is pretty old. People have been smoking and eating cannabis for many, many years. The stuff on the right, which I'm focusing on, vaporizers and cannabis, solvent-based cannabis extracts, really only appeared around in the last, well, vaporizers maybe 10, 20 years, 30 years, and extracts in the last 50 to 100 years. Bonus question there, and you guys maybe no one knows it, but just to give you an idea of how far this extraction has gone. Those on the top, those are diamonds. They run around 99% THC using extreme levels of solvent-based extraction. So not only are you going up in different types of products, but you're creating ever more concentrated, potent forms of cannabis. My research question and my research project, what I started with, didn't start with this question, took a lot of the classes like Doug's class, looking at really getting into the nitty-gritty of what's a good research question. So I'm going to do a little bit of that with you guys today to kind of gauge what I'm looking at here. So my question is, how does health information affect cannabis vaporizer, or affect Sonoma County cannabis consumers' perception and behavior with vaporizers and extracts? Now I'm talking about health information. My research incorporates theories of ignorance. So I'm not just looking at accurate information, I'm looking at inaccurate information. I'm looking at misinformation, disinformation, non-information. And I get that from Agmatology by Proctor and Scheibinger below. Looking at Sonoma County specifically, because it's where I'm from, I've done some ethnography there already with cannabis, and I've been given the gift of an education in California, and I thought the best way to use it was to focus on my own community rather than go to some far off exotic place like ancient anthropologists. Perception and behavior, I'm looking at what medical anthropologists will call lay epidemiology. This is the processes that people use to interpret the health risks and benefits of their behavior. So the everyday person. This includes informal and formal evidence, that health information I was talking about, from their personal networks and public arenas. My research methods to answer this question that I utilized, I started with recruitment. I used convenience and snowball sampling because they're really good methods for finding populations that are hard to find for research, AKA cannabis users, specifically vaporizers. It's also good for finding people that, finding populations of people that usually don't want to participate in research, like cannabis users. And then I had to screen them for eligibility to make sure they're all adults and to make sure they speak English and aren't involved in vulnerable research populations. Data collection methods, I really wanted to get face-to-face with people, because when I read the literature about vaporizing cannabis, it really relied heavily on online surveys and things that weren't really getting good qualitative data with real people. It was like filling out surveys, it just felt a little too impersonal to me, and I thought that my skills as an anthropologist were best suited for this. But of course, COVID happened right when I got approved to do my research. So I had to come up with new ways to do interviews face-to-face that still respected social distancing guidelines and people's safety, including my own. For data analysis, I made sure to audio record and transcribe all these and put them into what's really more of a data organization tool, which is a qualitative discourse analysis software like Atlas TI, which helps me organize all these interview data and help by idea that I'm focusing on, the ideas of health information, the ideas of legality that I'm looking at. And finally, I want to say a quick second about ethics. Because it's cannabis, some of the things that people share with me are very serious and people can go to jail for. So I had to be very careful about identity and protecting everyone's anonymity in this, which is why I had to go through such extensive lengths in terms of all of these methods. And what I got was some really good quality data on interviews about what people thought. This is Rick, and obviously Rick looks like that because that's not his real name, and I can't tell you who he is or what he looks like or anything like that. But Rick described to me his experience vaporizing cannabis. And I asked him about his first experience. He started when he was 18, And he and his friends made their own butane hash oil. That's one of those solvent-based extracts in their own home, which kind of dangerous. You can actually blow up your own home. There's been reports of that in Sonoma County, and he was doing that during that same time. He said it's just a new thing. This was before anyone really knew about or even thinking about, was it safe? So beginning, not a lot of health information here, not really affecting his perception or behavior. But after vaporizing cannabis, while he was smoking cannabis, while he was also eating cannabis every day, Rick began to get sick. Rick started throwing up. After 8 days, he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. He went to the hospital. And they told him he had cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And the way he puts it is that his body developed an allergic reaction to THC. So here's an unknown thing from vaporizing cannabis that appeared in Rick's life that he had really not a lot of way of predicting. Obviously, he was intaking massive amounts of cannabis in multiple different ways, but these are some of the unknown risks that I'm talking about that appear. What's interesting with Rick, after this experience, when the doctors told him you need to quit smoking because it's making you sick, he said, quote, "Nah, fuck you, dude," because he didn't trust the doctor because he perceived that the doctor had bias against cannabis. But really, when he went back and looked at it, he realized it was his bias about seeing cannabis as such a healing medicine that actually prevented him from accepting what was actually a correct diagnosis and medical advice from a doctor. Now, here's where it gets crazy. When he went to go research this diagnosis, he couldn't find information that was applicable or available on the internet or through scholarly articles. He found nothing. And normally when people find nothing, what he did is he went and resorted back to what he was good at, which is personal experimentation. And the problem with this is that he actually found a loophole in the information. He found that CBD did not instigate his hyperemesis. It is actually specifically THC that he was allergic to. So not only did Rick come into headbutt against medical literature and diagnosis, but he actually found a way to break through, which creates issues with the way that people perceive and absorb information, health information. When he looks at vaping now, he says, if I'm smoking, I know what the risks are, but when you're vaping, we don't know. My gut feeling is that it's not as healthy as we want it to be. And he says, people have been smoking weed for thousands of years and it kills them long and slow, and I don't want to die tomorrow just because of this product. So this is just one person, because I only have so much time today. When I looked at all 12 of my participants, this is what I saw when it came to how information affects their lay epidemiology. People value their personal and communal experience above everything else. 100% of the participants use personal experimentation, hearsay from their social network, and observe their cannabis community first and foremost. That is what changed their perception and their behavior. Now, for some people, not everyone, equal or less than personal and communal experience was the available and applicable public knowledge. But this might not be the knowledge that you're thinking of. A lot of people use cannabis industry info. That is, they worked in the industry making these things, they learned that way. Another large portion of people got their information from the dispensaries they bought their products from. Almost everybody, except for a couple people, relied on journalism and media, as well as scholarly articles. But they're specifically very skeptical of these sources because of misinformation and disinformation. And in terms of scholarly articles, they specifically focus on international articles, not US articles. And that's because the least impactful type of health information on people's perception and behavior overall is from officially US government sanctioned cannabis information. Everybody, pretty much everybody distrusted the cannabis information from the US government because they saw large amounts of bias from the drug scheduling system, as well as the research grade cannabis system. So looking at my research question again, how does health information affect Sonoma County cannabis consumers' perception and behavior with vaporizers and extracts? What we can see is that, again, I conceive of health information including misinformation and disinformation. So we're looking at complicating issues as well. And what we see is that misinformation and disinformation, especially from the most official sources like the US government, they create this imbalance in the mathematical equation of how people interpret their health risks and benefits from their behaviors. It creates an imbalance and makes people over-rely on their personal and communal experience rather than more formal forms of evidence. Now, misinformation, disinformation creates a skepticism of all information, which created a greater reliance on personal experience to assess the health risks and benefits, which creates potential long-term or health outcome surprises in long-term and heavy consumers, and less ability for public health to intervene. Now, this is a complicated issue, and I've been doing this for years, and I'm still not sure how we fix all of this. But the couple ideas that I've come up with, first and foremost, if you were talking to your friends, or this is everyday people you know, or if you yourself is interested in experimenting with cannabis products, vaporizing extracts, when these things seem too much, I made this little acronym, acute attentive cannabis use through epistemology. This basically means if somebody said to me, I used to just do whatever was handed to me until I became attentive and really paid attention to what products were out there, what I knew about them, and how I knew how they affected my body. And so epistemology is really the study of how you know what you know, what makes justified knowledge. And I encourage everyone that is considering discussing or thinking about cannabis use to really think about cannabis use this way. Be attentive and think about not only what you know about things, but what we still have yet to learn and maybe is unknown about these products. For research, I really encourage, and for my future career at least, I'm trying to instigate more medical anthropology methods and theories into cannabis vaporizer public health research. We need more qualitative data. We need more people-to-people ideas, not online surveys. And we need more, we need more people doing cannabis research. And finally, for the larger scope of federal US cannabis research, the government sanctioned stuff that nobody trusts, one thing that we could really do is just start deregulating research. That could either mean rescheduling cannabis so it's not Schedule I drug, or it could mean simply taking away the research grade cannabis production from the National Institute on Drug Abuse and giving it to a more objective institute like the National Institutes of Health, whose express goal is not to study drug abuse, but just health in general. That's really all I have for you today. I appreciate you guys listening to this project, and I encourage everyone to carefully consider these questions that I've asked you about how much you're really willing to accept of the unknown when you're making your health choices. Because even if it's not about cannabis, I think these are important questions to consider. So thank you very much. Cool. That was like almost right, 15 minutes. Great. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, we can move to questions. Can you exit? Yeah, thank you. So we can all see you. Questions for Ben?
Great, no questions. I'll just go then.
Cindy has a question. I see a hand.
No, not that easy. As you were speaking about this, I'm wondering, I mean, you're focused specifically on cannabis, but it seems to me that it's part of a larger movement that we have within this idea of self-treatment, and cannabis is viewed as natural. As you point out, it's not so natural anymore. It's actually gotten away from that. So where else, I mean, where do you see this going? Can you see it in a larger kind of scope?
You mean like these themes and topics beyond just cannabis that I'm focusing on?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I really got inspired by two main theories that I work with. One of them was the theory of agnotology, so theories of ignorance, and incorporating more theories of ignorance into both health education and public health research. And that really paired really well with the other concept that I found, which is lay epidemiology, which looks at how, really points out that the way that lay people interpret health risks is actually a lot closer to what epidemiologists are doing than what health education people assume the public thinks. And so when you combine those two together, you can see that the everyday people, when they're trying to make sense of what health behaviors are risky and which ones are maybe beneficial, they're really dealing with the same issues of modern misinformation, disinformation, just an overwhelming sources of information that epidemiologists are also dealing with. And they're running into some of the same problems with health research that professionals are running into. And I thought that was an important thing to highlight, not just for the people who are struggling to make sense of these things, but for also the public health researchers to realize that we're kind of all on the same team here, and that there are things we can do together to improve everybody's understanding of health.
We have a question from Abraham in the chat, Ben.
Okay.
Does your thesis discuss the use of peyote within Native American communities in Northern California in relation to health benefits?
No, I didn't go into peyote or any other specific drugs. And I'll tell you why. Doing cannabis research at this level is already very, very difficult. And trying to do something on harder drugs that are maybe, and I say harder drugs, but the way that drug scheduling works in the US is a little complicated. And I wanted to do what was literally seemed to me the easiest research project possible. I thought, what would be so hard about going out and talking to people about something? It's actually very hard. So I definitely agree that that would be really fruitful research, and I hope somebody else will go and do that. But I specifically didn't focus on that because I wanted to communicate these ideas in a way that was a little more palatable to the everyday public.
All right, thank you, Ben. Emma currently has her hand up.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for your presentation. I learned so much about cannabis I did not know before. I had a question about your methods. You said you use a snowball effect. How did you build rapport with your participants, and how did you make that initial interview? Did you do follow-up interviews?
Yeah, good questions. So this is like part of my research strategy is wrapped up in that concept I talked about of I'm from Sonoma County. I grew up here. But I also, when I went to San Francisco State and getting an education in the state, I have a history, I've done some smaller ethnographic projects along the way in my master's in Sonoma County. I also just have quite a large community. So part of the snowball effect was letting everybody I could possibly know, or even random people I meet, that sort of meme about like, let me insert my thesis into every everyday conversation. So that everybody knew what I was doing, and that if anybody was remotely interested, they knew who to find. And it can be really uncomfortable doing that because it seems very self-centered. You're like constantly talking about what you're doing and trying to get people to help you. And but what I found was that people really want to talk about this. And even though it was COVID, people were still really comfortable like being really honest with me, and they really trusted me. Because some of the stuff they said was really sensitive. And so, doing that initial interview, I often like allowed a little bit of time beforehand just to like let people get comfortable with me. And some of that helped as well. But yeah, I would say just rapport and time, putting in time in the community. And the snowball is really, really effective for this because people really trust their friends. So if your friend calls you and tells you this guy's cool, he's not a narc, people trust that, and that works really well for finding these kinds of populations. Did I answer most of that? I'm sorry if I got off topic, but.
Yeah, I think so. I was wondering also, sorry, one more question. Why cannabis? Like, did you consider a different topic, or how did you go in that direction?
That's a good question. I knew I wanted to do, I considered other topics, but most of my other topics were still cannabis. So the reason why I wanted to do cannabis was for a couple of reasons. I started in 2017 at SFSU, which, as some of you remember, was right after California legalized cannabis. So I knew that it was like starting really quickly, and I had the opportunity to research something really new and really recent. I also wanted to research cannabis because, like I said before, when we're talking about health and drug use, there's a lot of stigma around it, especially some of harder forms of drug use. For my undergrad, I studied homeless heroin addicts in San Francisco and public defecation. And it's somewhat hard, I don't know how to put this. When you're making an emotional argument, as we sometimes do, not within scientific arguments, it's sometimes hard to reach people about drug use because there's so much stigma through it. And because I saw that changing with cannabis, I thought that these ideas and these concepts would be received better and be kind of Trojan horse through something that is every day becoming more and more like socially illicit.
Okay, it looks like we have 2 minutes for another question. So Martha, I see you.
May I?
You're last. Yes, please.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for the presentation. So my question is this: if you had infinite ability to design the study situation, the study sample, the methods that you think would answer your research question most exhaustively, or to your sort of full scholarly satisfaction, I wonder, you know, assuming no obstacle of like who you could include, what you could observe, like how might you conceive of doing this study?
Yeah, that's a great question. This study particularly, well, obviously with endless resources and time, more people would be great. I had a relatively small sample size of 12 people. When I say that, I say small sample size for larger professional scientific studies. For the rest of you graduate students, 12 people is a lot of people. It makes a lot of data. So for what I had, I think it was good, but obviously like to get more of, what is it? Dr. Hill's points of causality, I would need a bigger population size. I would also really, you know, I wasn't able to include a lot of demographic data in this because of people's anonymity. I can't tell you about a person who, you know, what their ethnicity is, what their age is, and what their job is, because people can figure out who that is by what they say. And they could be arrested for it or who knows what. So some of these links of causality and information that I wanted to know that would have helped me draw, like, you know, what's this person's socio, you know, economic background? What's their demographic status? And these influences about how people perceive information and their health behaviors. I wasn't able to get that. So I would love to do that. And that's not really ever going to be possible until we fix some of these regulation issues around cannabis research. So that would be awesome. More people and getting like to include more about these people, which would be really nice, as we usually like to do in ethnography, but I just couldn't. So, you know, I think those are a couple things that I would love to do.
All right, so unfortunately we are at time for Ben, but thank you so much, Ben, for a really, really excellent presentation. And thank you so much for sharing your research with us. It was a real pleasure to see how your research project has progressed over the past, well, I guess 2 years now. That I've known you. Anyway, so we are going to move on to our last but not least presenter, Jessie Valdez. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Jessie. Take it away.
Hello, how's everyone doing? Can everybody hear me? Everybody see the screen? Okay. Okay. Hello, my name is Jessie Valdez, and I'm a second-year graduate student. I'm majoring in anthropology with specialization in archaeology, and I'll be presenting the work I've completed so far towards my master's thesis. I'm still in the process of submitting my proposal, so I do not have any results to share at this time. However, I do have a clear vision for what my thesis will look like. So for my thesis, I examined the Japanese ceramics found at Manzanar, which is a former incarceration camp. And to do this, I use a transnational approach. The image here is of Manzanar, California in Inyo County. And the stone here reads in kanji, Soul Consoling Tower, which is to acknowledge the suffering that Japanese Americans faced at this site. So before explaining my research question, I want to provide some background information. I am first going to discuss the history of the location, Manzanar's history as an incarceration camp, and I also want to discuss a bit about how Asian diaspora sites have been approached in archaeology, and discuss some of the important terminology, some relevant archaeological products that have taken the same approach that I'm going to take. And finally, I'll explain my research question and the methods that I'm going to use to answer it. And the image, just for some further information, is of Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. So first off, the site on which Manzanar is located, that land has a long history of use by Paiute and Shoshone groups. In 1864, Euro-American settler John Shepherd came to the area and used the land for cattle ranching. And later in 1905, George Chaffee bought this land and used it to form the town of Manzanar. From that point onward, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power began purchasing a lot of the land and water rights, which over time left less and less irrigation, less and less water left for the farmers to use for irrigating. And eventually the town was abandoned in the 1930s due to poor conditions. So at this point, it was an abandoned town, not a whole lot going on. And then Pearl Harbor happened. And in response to Pearl Harbor, in response to a lot of false rumors that there was a fifth column, that there was espionage on the part of Japanese that aided in the attack on Pearl Harbor. And despite having no proof, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which was used to forcibly remove Americans of Japanese descent from their homes and into incarceration camps. All the locations featured on this map are those incarceration camps, and the one in Eastern California is Manzanar. Manzanar was in operation from 1942 until 1945 and was referred to euphemistically as the Manzanar War Relocation Center. Due to its historical and archaeological significance to indigenous groups, and especially to Japanese American history, Manzanar was made a national landmark in 1992 and is now known as Manzanar National Historic Site. I also want to talk about how Asian diaspora studies were approached in North America. Many early Asian diaspora studies, typically about Chinese and Japanese American communities, had Orientalist themes. Asian cultures were often portrayed as exotic, static, and unchanging, in contrast to Western cultures, which were portrayed as modern and normal. This portrayal resulted in creating a dichotomy where material culture found at Asian diaspora sites was classified either as Western or non-Western. And the implications of this dichotomy meant immigrants had to choose one identity or another and left no room for dual complex identities. This dichotomy would also be used to argue if the Asian community being studied was assimilating and becoming American or Western. And conversely, if the material remains found fit preconceived notions of what traditional Asian material culture looked like, then it was presented as evidence of cultural continuity and rejecting Western practices. As a result, these approaches distorted our interpretation and understanding of Asian diaspora sites and material culture. A solution to getting rid of this distortion and reaching a better understanding is through a transnational approach. By transnationalism, I refer to bonds that are maintained by people that surpass national borders. And for example, remittances or material culture which represents dual or multiple national and ethnic identities of an individual group can be an example of transnationalism, or material culture representing transnationalism, or maintaining these transnational bonds. In the context of my project, transnational activities will take the form of trade flows of import-export ceramics, of domestic and foreign policies affecting those trade flows, and artistic styles which hold significance to national and ethnic identity. I use the image of the globe to reinforce the idea of the global scale of these relationships, while the image on the right shows various exported Japanese ceramics found at a British Columbian site. This brings me to my research question. What ceramic artifacts found at Manzanar are indicative of transnational activities? Well, to help answer my question, I want to look at how transnational frameworks have been used by other archaeologists studying Asian diaspora communities. So we have Dr. Barbara Voss and her co-authors who compared ceramics in San Jose Chinatown with ceramics found in a Chinese community in the Pearl River Delta, which many Chinese emigrated from. Examination reveals the difference in ceramic remains. The San Jose site had many Chinese export ceramics that were limited in variety and they were made for a unique customer, namely Chinese Americans, whereas the Pearl River Delta site saw more variety in the ceramics recovered, as well as less common artistic styles. This supports the argument that Chinese American identity is a unique identity, and archaeologists should not label a site as either more American or more Chinese based on the presence of Chinese export ceramics or frequency of European or American-made ceramics. And we also have Dr. Douglas Ross, who examined alcohol consumption and practices in a British Columbian site, Don Island. The ceramic collection earlier I showed was recovered from that site. Ross notes how alcohol consumption and remains can reflect the interaction of two or more countries. Japan had limited alcohol consumption and mainly produced sake at one time, prior to the Meiji Restoration. However, during the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, there was an appeal in Japan to some Western practices, including alcohol consumption and alcohol production. This led to many effects, such as drinking as a social bonding activity, whereas prior to the Meiji Restoration, it was only sake that was drinking, and it was drinking on very special occasions. But after the Meiji Restoration, or during the Meiji Restoration, I should say, drinking became a lot more of a social bonding activity. And this goes for the production of Japanese beer as well. In this way, imported Japanese beer can be interpreted as both Western and Japanese, just like many of its consumers. So even though beer is a Western product, when during the Meiji Restoration, companies in Japan wanted to make their own beer and make Japanese beer, that was a reflection of these two countries interacting and sharing ideas. Therefore, to classify remains of Japanese beer as distinctly Japanese or distinctly Western, it is an inaccurate portrayal of material remains. For my research, I will record data on the ceramics at Manzanar by using archaeological reports and images, which I will obtain from the California Historic Information Resources System. I will also use Jeff Burton's 3 Farewells to Manzanar, which is a compiled book of archaeological reports that contains the results of the archaeological work there and offers context for ceramics recovery. For my data, I will look at the availability and popularity of the ceramics qualities, their artistic styles, and the companies that produce them. These details, as evidenced by the similar work of Voss and Ross, will offer insight into the trade relationship between the United States and Japan prior to World War II, as well as consumer preferences during that time. I'm still in the process of getting reports from Chris IC, but I currently have 3 Farewells to Manzanar, which has shown much of the data I need, particularly in describing artistic styles. This will help me determine how Manzanar's Japanese ceramics were influenced by the transnational relationships maintained by Japanese Americans. Thank you. There we go.
All right, thank you so much, Jessie, for presenting your thesis proposal and thesis research with us. We have some time for some questions, so I'm going to turn it over to our attendees.
I'll ask a question.
Yeah, Ben.
I know we talked about it in our practice about what questions you might want to ask. You might want to be asked, but I'm not going to give you a free ball. I'm going to ask a question. Because I guess this is tough because when people ask, like one of the questions I liked earlier from Erica's presentation was about how archaeology sometimes remains apolitical. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on that same question for your project, because you're dealing with something that is very sensitive and serious and talking about concentration camps, and it has political ramifications in the past as well as today. So I don't know if does that affect your the way you write, the way you study these things, the way you look at this project at all? Or is that something you're trying to maybe avoid for a different reason?
Absolutely. It absolutely changes the way, or it affects the way I study this. I mean, I think what was most shocking when I was learning about 9066 was that it didn't explicitly order Americans of Japanese descent into incarceration camps. It opened the gates for it. It made it legal. And that's a pretty scary thought. And I think one that we need to keep in mind forever, that we should be looking at laws that are set and standards that are set, which maybe don't explicitly target people, but kind of open the gates for that, or that set this implication that it's okay when it's not. As far as being apolitical, I mean, when looking at this, it's kind of impossible to be apolitical. It was involved in politics. There was no proof that there were Americans of Japanese descent that were aiding Japan, and yet they got locked away despite that. Does that answer your question? Perfect. Cindy?
Yeah, this actually plays a little bit into Ben's question too. And also I see some strands and similarities between your and Erica's work, which really get to the heart of the idea of assimilation, what it means to be American. And I'm just wondering where you think maybe there might be a position for archaeology to engage this more within the public sphere, because it's very, we can sit here and talk academically about it, but you're looking at some very fundamental questions that are really relevant right now. And so what do you see your place in as far as the public engagement aspect of it?
As far as public engagement goes, not being a member of the Japanese American community, there's only so much I can do. I'm hoping that this can contribute in some way to sites like Manzanar or cultural community centers. I took an Asian American Studies class last semester, and for my project, I had to do a report on one of the local community centers, and I did so in San Francisco's Japanese Northern Californian Cultural Community Center. And I really liked what they were doing as far as programs that would help Japan in some ways, or kind of educate people on what it meant to be Japanese American. Not to be someone of Japanese descent, but to be Japanese American right now at this time, and what it looked like in the past. So all I can really hope for is that I can contribute to that in some way, in multiple fields, perhaps. Yeah, Emma?
Thank you for your presentation. I think this is really exciting research. I was wondering, how did you choose Manzanar? What makes it unique to study sherds in a transnational context?
As far as Manzanar goes, I think I just chose it because, well, I knew I wanted to do an incarceration camp just because I think it's important to talk about and discuss. And I think of all the places to like show the strength of someone that wants to show their Japanese American identity, I think that's the place to look at. I've already looked at other sites such as Gila River. I looked at Koji's work and those incarceration camps, and I really just chose Manzanar just because it was closer to me, and ironically, I thought it would be easier to get to, but I don't foresee myself traveling to Manzanar anytime soon. But all I knew is I really wanted to do incarceration camps. Anyone else?
If there's no one else, I'm going to jump in with an archaeology question for you, Jessie. I have a similar question actually to Emma, so thank you, Emma, for setting this up. But I was curious why you chose ceramics and the importance of studying ceramics. What kinds of information can we learn from them, especially you know, within your transnational like theoretical framework? Like, what's the importance of ceramics that, you know, other kinds of information, you know, historical narratives, documents, things can't tell you? Like, why did you choose them?
I think, well, partially when I was still developing what my thesis was going to look like, I really liked Dr. Ross's work on alcohol consumption. And I liked that idea of, I guess, this mix of alcohol where it can be both Japanese and Western. And the reason I wanted to choose ceramics is because I think they're similar in regards that they're something so common and something used on a regular basis. But what's also unique about them is that they're not just commodities to buy. There's all this personal preference just based on the art. And that determines not only cost, but determines popularity. It determines how that represents what you want your household to represent. So even though I still have a lot more research to do as far as artistic styles that were popular during that time, I think ceramics can represent a lot about identity.
Great, thank you, Jessie.
Thank you.
Any closing questions? Okay, it doesn't look like it. On that note, then, we will bring our MA Expo to a close. I want to thank our presenters again for generously sharing their time, their research, putting this all together for us. And I want to thank our attendees for supporting their peers. Thank you, faculty members, really, really excellent presentations. It was such a pleasure to see how your research has grown and progressed over the past few years and where it's gonna go in the future. So really well done. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.